It's amazing to be reading a 19th century critic of capitalism, a person trying to figure out what's going on. What is that song? What's going on? There's something going on. Do you know that song? It's not the Down by the Dock guy. There's something going on. Something going on here. There's a man with a gun over there saying, "Me, that I've got to beware." Nobody knows that song. Funny. You must be from a different generation than me. But the what's going on part is the part which is kind of hammering on my brain as we read through these writings of Marx. But I've also been reading these other people, Carlyle and Hertz, and people that you read about in the ebook that I asked you to read last week, because each of them is trying to answer the question. In this confusing world of 1830, 1840 through 1860, 1870, with change happening in every dimension, in politics, in economics, in culture, in international things, in the end of slavery, in so many different aspects of life, how does it all tie together? And more to the point, how can the world that we're living in, I'm still talking 1840, how can the world that we're living in be a more humane world? How can it be a better world for human beings? That's the question that Hobbes was asking and Locke is asking. And in a weird way, very different methodology, but that's the question that Thomas Carlyle was asking, and so was Karl Marx, so was Engels. They had ideas about it, but they were very partial ideas. They had incomplete understanding of what's going on. It's right on the tip of my tongue who sings that great song. What's going on? Somebody's on Google. Let's get an answer to that question anyway. That important philosophical question. Who sang What's Going On? That's right. Yeah. And Mitchell got here just in time not to hear that. So what I wanted to do today is we've kind of been talking about where Marx stands, what his thought processes are. And I have that nice graph, I guess you call it, of what his main lines of critique are. So his idea that contemporary society, contemporary meaning 1850, let's say, is exploitative. That means it has to do with class economic relationships. It is dominative or domination. It's a system of relations of domination and power. And it is alienating. Those are the three lines of thought which come out of Marx's writings. And they're very powerful lines of thought. They don't do what Marx thought they did. He thought that they pointed to a solution. And the solution was socialism. It was the creation of a class-free order. I can't recall if Marx used the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat, but I kind of think that he did, dictatorship of the proletariat. But even that phrase doesn't mean what dictatorship means for Hobbes, because Marx thought that the proletariat, the working class, was increasingly the universal class. It was almost everyone. And in a weird kind of way, it's sort of a, well, I'm not even going to say that it was a democratic idea, but it was an idea about the great mass of society should run the affairs of society. Those are ideas that Marx had, and they turned out to be devastatingly destructive ideas in the hands of Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, and Bukharin, and people who were often inspired by a desire to make the world better, but who took ideas which turned out to be crushing of human freedom, crushing of the idea of real human equality. The Gulag, you've read about the Gulag, you read about the Gulag in my little manuscript. The prison camps that Stalin established. What a perversion of the idea of genuine human freedom, which Marx believed that he was advocating for. So, in other words, that's why I start with the idea of critique, that Marx is offering critique, without the idea that it leads naturally to an obvious solution. We can roll forward to the year 2022. It's too bad it's not February 22nd, 22. That would be a very auspicious day to say this, 22222. But for us, are we equally confused about where a humane society should be going? Or do you think it's perfectly clear where a humane, good, and just society should be going? Again, I don't want to spend the whole class talking about this, but I would like just a quick kind of temperature check from you. Are we fairly clear about where a humane, just, and free society, what it should look like, how it should be restructured so that it's more genuinely fulfilling of human needs, human equality, and human freedom? Or are we in a situation where we need, smart people thinking new ideas, new, kind of almost philosophical frameworks for understanding the situation that we're currently in? What do you think? Are we confused, or do we know where we're going? Yeah.
I think it's like the path of kind of ways to get to society like that was crystal clear. I think that there's obviously been smart enough people in this world up throughout history that if that path was so clear, I think we would have already gotten there. So I don't think, because I think it's a very complicated kind of problem, and I think that's why obviously society is still very far from what it is now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's almost an implication of what you say that I'll just draw out. I'm not sure that you meant it. The implication is Marx and maybe a few of these other critics actually did get to, their diagnosis was good. They were good doctors of the health of society. The patient has cancer, diabetes, and a broken foot. And the solution is an angel should rescue them. That's not a very good solution, since angels seem to be few and far between these days. But their diagnosis, I think the implication of your comment was their diagnosis was correct. That's not even completely clear. This theory, for example, is all about the very first line, the premises of political economy. It's kind of an economic approach. It's the human being as an economic being. But what else are we besides being an economic being? Are we a loving being? Are we a family being? Are we a cultural being? And does Marx kind of not get there? Does he is his understanding of society limited and single, I don't know, kind of single color, monochromatic is the word I'm looking for. You were going to make a point.
I was gonna say that, yeah, I don't think it's very easy to form a humane society as a society. I think it takes a lot of individual effort and individual choices in order to form a better society, because in the end, not everybody is gonna want to move as one, and they're all gonna want to make their own choices and do their own things. So I feel like it comes to making a more humane individual first, and then that can create a humane society.
Okay. So what's really interesting to me about what you say is that you sound a lot like John Stuart Mill in the book On Liberty, which you haven't read, but I've referred to it a couple of times. And it is a classic liberal view, in the best sense of the word, that the best way to create a good and just and humanly fulfilling society is to enable individual human beings to be free, to develop themselves as free human beings, and to live in peace, not in the fear of violence. And then, so we don't design society, rather we design arrangements so that human beings can be free, equal, and fully developed. Again, I'm attributing a little bit more than what you said, but that's a different view. Marx, or even more, the Bolsheviks had the view, we have a structure that we are intending to create. It'll take us 75 years. And it is a structure, it is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it will be the right context for humanity. Trust us, and we will kill an awful lot of you. Sorry. Well, no, they weren't even that sorry. Stalin was certainly not that sorry. That begins with the idea, if we can give you a social ideal, which we will create, we, the Bolsheviks, will create, or we, the Nazis, will create, or we, the Maoists, will create. The ideal is where we're going, and you human beings need to adapt yourselves to the ideal. Your picture and John Stuart Mill's picture is very different from that. It is the social framework needs to exist for one and only one goal, and that is the enablement of the free, equal, and full development of human beings. And what does that require? Well, gosh, we're already back to HONS. Does this seem like there's a Nietzschean idea, actually, we're going to be talking about not too long. It's the idea of the eternal recurrence. We come around to the same situation again, because we're sort of back there. Well, okay, free and equal human beings, except I'm a radical populist and I believe we should lock up the governor, and you are a radical liberal and you think, you know, we should support the law of the state, but we can't agree. So my militia is more powerful than your militia, and so I win. That's the Hobbesian problem. It's the use of violence to assert one way of the world, one conception of the world over another. And how would we escape from that? Well, now we're going back through the eternal recurrence. We establish a system of law. And we kind of recapitulate the course, except what's worrisome about that picture is we started in 1600 or so with Hobbes, kind of going through the premises of what a state ought to provide for its citizens. And we got up to the 20th century and we came to fascism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, communism. We came to these crushing regimes which seemed to destroy liberalism. And then after World War II, there was the idea that liberal democracies can be the future, except communism, USSR, and the subject states of the Warsaw Pact. That was a quarter of humanity. And then when you add, it's probably half of humanity when you add China. So in other words, unfreedom. Well, the point I'm kind of getting at is we've been tussling with really hard questions. What is an appropriate setting? What should we aspire to create for humanity, for the 8 or 7.5 billion of us human beings on planet Earth? And how can we avoid the dysfunctions, the dystopias, which have, you know, killed and injured and deformed so many of us in the past 200 years? That's the point of critique. It's trying to figure out what's going on. Marvin Gaye, what's going on and why is it happening and how can we change it? How can we change it? So that's just a prelude. That's the in Kantian philosophy, Kant's philosophy. You always begin a philosophical essay with a propaedeutic. I'm not sure which linguistic tradition it comes from. It sounds a little Greek to me. A propaedeutic. It's the introductory statement. The introductory statement is all of this stuff matters a lot for you much more than me, even though it matters for me because I have grandchildren and I want them to live in a peaceful, equal, and free world. What could you call that? Is that just an older person who cares about, you know, 4 specific other individuals? Or could you call it something else humanly important? What is it to be concerned about your children and your grandchildren? Yeah, legacy, legacy, that makes it about me. But actually, I don't think that's quite right. It's intergenerational concern. Do we have intergenerational concern, would you say? Do we care about the next generation and the following generation? What do you think? Do we?
Yeah, I think so.
Uh-huh. Have you ever heard the, it's kind of a, oh gosh, what is it? It's kind of a, probably not even true, but there is the idea that there's a Native American philosophy that says that we should make plans out to the 7th generation. Have you ever heard that before? I'm not sure, where it comes from, but it is attributed to Native American philosophy. And how would the world be different if we actually did care about the 7th generation? Well, one thing is we would take climate change much more seriously. We would take resource depletion much more seriously. We would take pollution much more seriously, because the fact that we can get through climate change for the next 20 or 30 years, which isn't at all a fact. There's a lot of reason to be worried about what happens in the next 20 or 30 years. Perfectly clear that 100 years from now, climate change has dramatic, horrendous consequences. We can ignore those consequences only if we can shutter our moral imagination and not think about the 3rd generation, the 4th generation, 5th generation. So when I say I care about my grandchildren, that's 2 generations, and I care about the world that they'll go into. It's actually a little hard to imagine the 7th generation or the 4th or the 5th generation. And yet, if we don't have that cross-time concern and connection, then it's really hard to think about global justice, about justice for humanity. Okay, that's Supropadudic. For today, I had a different goal. And my goal was, we've talked now about Marx, kind of what is he trying to do and what are his insights. But what I wanted from you is random thoughts, that things which were striking to you from the readings that you've now done out of 3 or 4 pieces of Marx's writings. We've got the theory of alienation here. I also put up, I can put up all 4 of the things that you've read up to this point. Communist Manifesto. While you're collecting your thoughts, I'll put up the other 2 readings. But what I'm soliciting from you is your own kind of reaction to it. Was it intelligible? Did it make sense to you? Or was it kind of, that's old-fashioned writing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Let's look at that one. And if we get to the 18th Brumaire, the 18th Brumaire is a kind of a different book, but any reactions to start with. But I think I'll put the strange labor back, because that was the very first thing that you read. Any things that you'd like to say? Comments about alienation and strange labor? I'm going to find a passage that I think it would have. Yeah, here we go. This is a passage. Maybe you could comment on this passage. Can you see it? I was looking for the expand this view button, but I don't see that. I'm like not.
Oh, do you mean like make the document full screen?
Yeah, except I realized.
It's the arrow with the that's on the right.
Oh, that thing. Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
And maybe we'll just move the image off the screen. No, I can't. I'm not allowed to. Okay. So commentary on this passage. This is the theory of alienation. You might say this is one of the really profound ideas or critiques that Marx offers. What do you make of this? And how is it about alienation? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess the way I interpret it is that for Marx, we're going to see our conditions as being constraining upon our possibilities, because humans perceive the fundamental human act or the act of agency is sort of transforming the world, but our conditions that we're already thrown into sort of constrain the ways in which we're able to actually manipulate that world. And then perhaps alienation is just going to be a certain kind of restriction on the way in which we transform the world, and thus a sort of violation of our fundamental agency.
So is alienation itself a cause of things, or is it the consequence of certain social arrangements?
This is the consequence.
Okay, and what is it the consequence of?
It's going to be consequences of such productive forces, according to Marx. So it's going to be basically certain possible are conditions that sort of constrain the possibilities that we have for action. So, for example, I can't make a computer without certain rare materials
Yes.
that I can construct it out of. So, particular society will put that more production things I have. And so you're going to be in the same way here, you're alienated that the conditions of production to constrain the social relations that you're in. And thus subject you to alienation.
So, but the social relations, is it that there's not enough silicon around for me to make a great computer? I'm really smart. I'm a computer engineer, but unfortunately, it's just not enough silicon. The resources don't exist, so I can't make a great computer. Sorry. Is that the problem? Or is it instead that there is a social system that I need to fit into? And I'm not even given the opportunity to become an engineer. Instead, I am a nameless, proletarian, interchangeable worker in a factory in Manchester or is there an Amazon warehouse in Michigan that you're aware of?
There is.
There are many of them.
one in Livonia.
Okay, in Livonia, and they have like 500 employees there?
It's pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so 500 employees, you've just gotten a job at Amazon, you're getting an income, it's probably $15 an hour. I think haven't they moved all of their
Yes.
wages to $15 an hour?
It's like 15.50.
Okay, so you're getting a wage, but now that's what I'm kind of eliciting. That person, is she in a position to enable her human capabilities of freedom and creativity, or is she deadened by her conditions of work? That's actually what Marx is getting at. Yes, Molly.
I would say one thing it kind of reminds me of is like kind of when you're like an hourly pay, and like let's say you and your coworker, like you're really hard worker, you get a lot of stuff done, but your coworker really doesn't. At the end of the day, they're paid the same amount. So the person who works harder is technically cheaper than the other one because you're doing a bunch of stuff and you might have to.
So that doesn't seem fair.
Right, so it's kind of like, it reminds me because he's like, kind of like cheaper commodity with more commodity he creates, I guess, and maybe that's not what he meant, but it's kind of like, the more somebody does on like an hourly wage, it's basically like you're cheaper than somebody who
Okay.
doesn't do as much.
There's a labor psychology fact that maybe follows from that, which isn't, I think, what Marx was thinking of, but it's just worth drawing the inference. It was a joke in Poland in the 1980s in communist factories. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Exactly. What you're describing is an impulse towards, wait a minute, I'm working super hard. I'm getting 3 times as much done as Daniel is. I'm going to lay off a little bit. I'm going to work only as hard as Daniel. I'm just picking a person, a name, not a person's work ethic. So that's kind of you might say it's kind of a consequence of a certain labor practice. I don't think that is the main point that Marx is getting at here. What he's saying is the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. That's rhetoric, but what does it mean actually? It means that, think of that factory in Manchester, which is now actually producing a lot of wealth. It's producing whatever, I don't know what they're making. They're making shirts or woven goods or whatever. They're selling on a world market. They're bringing a ton of money into the coffers of the owner. It's not a stock company because mostly production was privately owned by individuals rather than big stock, corporations. So the owner of the company is getting richer and richer. He's selling a lot of woven goods. And he's got now lots of coaches. He's got a nice mansion in Manchester. Things are going well for the owner of the factory. But what about the workers? The workers are not doing well. They become poorer the more wealth they produce. Marx doesn't even think that's the most important problem. But he's got three problems that we're going to see if we can identify each of them. There was another comment that somebody had in the northwest quadrant of the room. I saw a hand. I forget who had it.
I was raising my hand. I heard about this before, and I always thought alienation was like, you used to make something and you would like see it. Like it used to be in like not medieval times, but like pre-industrial revolution. You would make like a shirt or something, and then you would have it because it would be your shirt or like a kid's shirt or whatever, and you'd be able to be proud of like whatever you made. But now that because of the industrial revolution, you're in factories, you make like 100 shirts a day or whatever, and you don't really care about it anymore, even though you're putting labor into it to make it. Like it's not the same like connection of like, oh, I worked hard and I made an unreachable thing. It's like, oh, now I'm just the guy who hits this button 100 times.
Yeah. So that's what he means when he says the worker has been separated from the product. The artisan, you're exactly right. The artisan made a saddle, made, put shoes on a horse or whatever. That artisan work, there was a direct connection between my labor skills and a particular product. In a factory, that's not the case. I do a tiny little thing, doesn't take much skill. That's what Henry Ford loved about factories, is that you could take unskilled workers and you could make cars without ever having to skill people up. Would there be by the way, an economic interest for Henry Ford to de-skill? What is the economic interest? I think we talked about this last time, but just kind of quick interest.
People don't have to train them. You can just hire anyone.
You can hire anyone, that's A. B.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say they're more accessible and they're more replaceable.
Yeah, there's that, but also there's the fact that the skilled worker can demand a higher salary. If she is actually a numerically controlled machine expert, and there are only 1,000 of them in the whole US economy, then competition among firms is going to push their wages up. If you can take the skill out of numerically controlled machines so that it's just, you need a high school education, then you've pushed that person back into the 1550 range. You've pushed down the cost of labor. Do you know that there's a threat of a strike on the West Coast in the we call them docks, the harbors, the docks, I guess we call them. Dock strike on the West Coast of the dock workers union. And do they have leverage or not have leverage? They have a ton of leverage because you can't unload. You've probably seen, you saw the tanker that got sideways in the Suez Canal. Do you remember that several months ago? It's kind of comical. This huge boat that was sideways and blocking all the traffic in the canal. Its sister is now sideways in Chesapeake Bay. It ran aground. You can only take those boats to certain places. So if a labor union has an ability to cause a strike in those few places, then that changes the bargaining position of workers. Do you think that Amazon as a company would be thinking about that problem? It used to get all of its Chinese goods through the port of Long Beach, California. Its Chinese products came in through Long Beach, and that was a great supply chain. But Long Beach is, Long Beach it wasn't labor problems. It had, I'm sure you saw the pictures of, hundreds of ships just waiting to come into Long Beach. So the backup in the supply chain. What was the solution that Amazon tried to come up with as a trading company? It basically, did the intelligent thing. It tried to figure out what are some other ports around the world, or around the country, which could be where you could offload smaller ships. So you can kind of disaggregate. I mean, it's a smart solution, but you could kind of look at this as being the perennial struggle of cost containment. How can we avoid the power of dock workers in Long Beach by offloading in Tacoma? Tacoma is another big West Coast port in Seattle. Can we come up with small port solutions which negate the organizing power of labor unions in Long Beach and Tacoma, let's say? So the separation of the labor product from the workers' control, that is one of the separations. All these consequences are implied in the statement that the worker is related to the product of labor as to an alien object. What's he talking about there? I'm making shirts. I'll forget about Amazon because they don't make anything at all at Amazon. They distribute stuff, so it's a kind of a special case. But let's say a shirt factory in North Carolina where they make shirts. It's a non-unionized factory, and the wage is $10.50. The working time, you probably never heard of the struggle for the 10-hour bill in the 1840s or 50s in Parliament. There was a major labor struggle to achieve the 10-hour bill. And can you guess what that is? The 10-hour bill? That the length of the working day was to be set to 10 hours. Come in at 7, leave at 5. Come in at 9, leave at 7. I think I got that right. That sounds like 10 hours. 10 hours, does that sound like a great working day to you? Well, not exactly, but it's way better than 12 hours. So it was a major struggle between workers who were not unionized, by the way. There were very few labor unions in the 1830s, 40s. The Chartist movement was something like a labor union, but it wasn't really a union. It was a workers' movement. Efforts to control the length of the working day, efforts to control the health and safety conditions in factories, those were emerging struggles in the 1840s, 1850s. And the 10-hour bill did in fact pass. So, but what happened within those 10 hours? Marx's point is the worker, now let's go back to North Carolina, the worker is making tons and tons of shirts for sale at Lord & Taylor. Lord & Taylor is the major buyer, and the shirts sell, the men's shirts, rather handsome, and they're $90 a shirt. His basic point, it's a polemical point, is the workers in that factory can't afford to buy a shirt from Lord & Taylor. So they can't buy those shirts. They're separated from those shirts. They're alienated from the product of their labor. Objectification. How does the worker how does he or she satisfy conditions of life? What are the conditions of life? Are workers like trees where they just spread their arms and they take in the solar and they have chlorophyll in their hands and they satisfy their needs by standing out in the sun? Obviously not. It's a silly idea. So how do workers satisfy their needs? Do they grow their own little piglets and have roast pig every couple of days? In a transitional period in Britain, that was true, actually. Workers might have a little plot, grow some veggies, have a pig or two. In fact, when my wife was growing up in France, her father worked for the railroad, but they also had a substantial garden. They had a couple of pigs, and they had some other animal that they had, I forget what it was. So they were kind of a mixed economy of subsistence and labor, but that economy did not persist. So what Marx is talking about is a transition to a purely wage labor economy. And in a pure wage labor economy, $10.50 an hour, 8-hour workday at so-and-so shirt factory in North Carolina. There's a strict limit to how much you can buy. You have to have housing, you have to have access to food, you have to have the occasional, what else do you need? I don't know. Food, drink, you don't really need to go to the pubs. You can cut the pubs out of the story. Don't need the movies, cut the movies out of the story. What is the good of a movie, by the way? Why does a worker even need a movie? Why is there an entertainment line in a worker's budget? In a more disciplined economy, wouldn't workers just not have movies?
Well, just you have to be like intellectually entertained, you know, like you can't just work and what, and whatever. Like you have to have something fun, you have to be, you know.
Yeah, just going to work at, in the 10-hour day thing, working intensively. Is the capitalist, is the owner of the factory really interested in having you relaxed at the end of the day when you go home? No, he wants every minute of labor time. It's kind of an idealized picture that I'm presenting. It's Marx's picture of the factory, but it's not so foreign to us, I don't think. What is the purpose of a supervisor at Circuit City? I know Circuit City doesn't exist anymore, but what was the purpose of a supervisor? It was to make sure that people weren't goofing off. That's why The Office is such a funny show. Anybody watch The Office? It's kind of the inane activity of supervisors, but they have a function. They have an economic function. It is to maintain the effort of the workers in an environment in which they are alienated. They're not happy in their work. I believe I've told you the true story I learned about the Rouge plant, but I'll share it again because it's a pretty good story. A member of the Ford family took me on a walking tour of the Rouge plant. He said, we used to have these public, we of course have them again now, you can go to the Rouge plant. Used to have public tours of the Rouge plant until visitors would see things. I love telling the story, and I realize I told it before, and it's probably very boring for you. But visitors would see a worker on the line doing his work and crumpling up a Coke can, tossing it inside a steel thing, welding it shut, and then that Ford Pinto hits the road to an unsuspecting consumer who scratches his head and says, "There's some kind of weird rattle in my car. Why'd you do that? Why'd that worker do that?" This is like Jeopardy. You gotta respond quick because we got a lot to get to do. Why did that worker do that? Is it that he hates the Ford Motor Company? Not exactly. What do you think?
He was thirsty, I don't know.
No, not thirsty. The Coke he had, there was a trash receptacle there, so he could toss the can. There was some meaning in this gesture. But what was the meaning? It's not that obscure, really. It was a gesture about the company and the work relations, wasn't it? Don't you think? Or not? And Ford, is it Ford? Is it General Motors? It doesn't really matter. It's the discipline of assembly line work. Has anybody ever worked on an assembly line in this room? I have. I worked at the Caterpillar tractor company, which dominated my city, Peoria, Illinois, and now they're no longer there. I'm not going to ask you about music much anymore, but Bruce Springsteen's song, "My Hometown," those companies are gone and they're not coming back. Caterpillar tractor's gone from Peoria, Illinois, and the factories are gone, and the headquarters is gone. But when I worked on the assembly line, I myself was not alienated because I found it kind of interesting because I was a college student and I was interested in how people lived. But the young men from Kentucky who worked on my line, who had come to Peoria from Kentucky to get a good job, it was a good job. I paid my way all the way through college with the wages. It's like, I don't know, it was a lot of money in those days. And I was a UAW member. It was a good contract. But the fellow workers were totally alienated from their work. They didn't, I mean, this sounds like a deficiency on their part. That's not the point I'm making. They didn't take pride in their work. We make these tractors which transform America. We're doing the work of America and making these tractors. Instead, they found their work alienating, off-putting. I could imagine them putting the crumpled up Coke can into, except there are no closed steel bodies in a tractor, so you wouldn't necessarily find that way of expressing. I myself caused huge damage in that factory inadvertently. My job was to use an air hose to get the water off the tractor as it was moving along the line into the paint shop. Thank goodness I didn't continue on into the paint shop. I would have probably died of cancer or something by now. But inadvertently, I bumped the little lever that allowed the ripper thingy to go down. And the line just kind of pulled it along and had to be stopped and pulled up a whole bunch of stuff. The rippers are really good. They really do a lot of good ripping, but they shouldn't be activated in the assembly line. But that was inadvertent. It wasn't a sign of alienation. The Coke can in the Pinto is a sign of alienation. It's a sign of separation from the company. It's a sign of saying, I don't feel that I belong here. I don't feel I'm respected here. I don't feel I'm, this is my life being. My life being is elsewhere. In fact, there is a line here where Marx says something like, when I am in my place of work, I am not a human being. When I am a human being, I am not working. Work and life are completely separated. Does that ring a bell at all? Is it real in our society? Well, yeah, I mean, you can think about it. I kind of have the feeling from reading a lot about Amazon warehouses that it is a reality for Amazon warehouse workers, that it's very hard to say, this is work that I really care about. Instead, there's the boss, there are the 3 cameras, here's the little detector on my shirt that makes sure that I'm not going to the bathroom too often. Monitoring, surveillance, supervision, getting fired if I'm not hitting my productivity targets. Frank, I think that's what Marx is talking about when he talks about this first form of alienation. Political economy conceals the estrangement. Estrangement is alienation, separation. What is it to be estranged? If you had a good friend in high school and you had a falling out, you were estranged from that person. You could no longer communicate with that person. Well, estrangement in this instance is estrangement from a part of yourself, your creativity, your ability to change the world through your skills and your intelligence and your human capabilities. What then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, it is the fact that labor is external to the worker, that the worker is just hired to do the 10 hours or 12 hours of work. And while he or she is doing that work, she's not her own person. She's just, in a sense, a living machine for the company. It does not belong to his intrinsic nature. The work does not belong to his intrinsic nature. In his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself. How do you affirm yourself through work? Well, it's kind of where you started in talking about alienation. If you were an artisan at the beginning of the 19th century and you made saddles, each of your saddles is unique. And when people buy your saddle, they say, well, I bought it from Dan the saddler. And he's locally known to be a fantastic saddler. And if you buy a saddle from Dan, super. It's going to be a saddle you'll never fall out of. So I take pride in the saddles I make. If I go to work in the saddle factory, what I do is I attach the little stirrup thingy to the little attachment thingy. I can no longer take pride in creativity of creating the saddle. That's what he's talking about. His labor is no longer voluntary, but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Would Marx's picture be improved? Would he have a better view if wages were generous? So that yes, you're during the working day, you're working quite hard and it's under the control of a supervisor, but you are paid a wage that amounts to, let's say, $50,000 a year or $55,000 a year. Actually, does that sound familiar in Michigan? It does sound familiar in Michigan. What were we famous for in the 1950s? That ordinary working class people had middle class lives. That because of UAW, basically, because of unionized work in auto factories, ordinary people with a high school education, unskilled work, were able to get jobs which allowed them to have a cabin up north, the boat, and send their kids to college and so forth. Alienated or not alienated? Well, now it's a little more complicated. They're alienated from the product of their work. You know, maybe they're making Lincoln Continentals, and the only people who can buy them are gangsters. Plenty of room in the trunk for two bodies, so that's what's really great about a Lincoln Continental. You have to be a hitman. They're alienated from the product. They can't buy that product, but they can buy a lot of other products. So their wage is satisfactory, and they have a decent house in Livonia or wherever, I don't know, where auto workers used to live. So their material standard of living is not what Marx is describing. Marx is describing miseration or immiseration. He's talking about a situation where workers are pushed down to the bare minimum, where they can barely make ends meet. Is that familiar in America, by the way? Is there a significant population of people working in America who just barely make the grocery bill, the rent bill, the tax bill, et cetera? Yeah, for sure. So it's not unrealistic what Marx is saying, even for the 20th century. As a result, therefore, man, the worker, only feels himself active in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating. I believe he's speaking euphemistically. I believe procreating means actually having sex, or at most in his dwelling and in dressing up, etc. He is only acting freely in his consumption and his, kind of most basic bodily activities, but not in his work. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, what is human becomes animal. Certainly eating, drinking, procreating are also genuinely human functions, but taken abstractly, separated from the sphere of all other human activity and turned into the sole and ultimate ends, they are animal functions. We still have the third aspect of the strange flavor to deduce. This is actually, I would say, his most penetrating point. The first 2 points are kind of sociological. And you might say that they're historically temporary, except that I think you all agreed that that tendency to drive wages to a tough situation for workers, not necessarily a starvation situation, but a tough situation, that is kind of a tendency of the market economy. But those are sociological observations. This observation is more profound. Man is a species being. That is, man is a lofty human nature, not only because in practice and in theory, he adopts a species, his own as well as those of other things, as his object, but also because he treats himself as the actual living species, because he treats himself, this is the important sentence, he treats himself as a universal and free being. This is almost Kantian, Kant, Immanuel Kant. It is, what is the essence of the human being? It is to be conscious, reflective, and free. And Marx takes the view that to be a proletarian in 1840 or 1850 or 60 in England, you're separated from your species being. Did I see that in my Kentucky working class pals at Caterpillar Tractor? Well, I'll say what I saw, and then you can tell me, well, you're kind of a elitist guy, actually. But what I saw was these men who were really, I don't know, disaffected from the company they were working for. When they got off work, they were really eager to, get out and have fun. So fun is bars, parties, just the kind of stuff that he was just mentioning. These are the activities that the worker is reduced to. My Kentucky pals were not going, now this is where the elitism maybe comes in. They were not going home and reading a little bit of Marx. They were not going home and watching War and Peace in a dramatization. Should they? Is that an important part of species being? Is there a difference between watching, what was a TV show that people used to watch? What was that Texas show? Who shot so-and-so on Dallas? Was that the name of it? Yeah, Dallas, kind of a soap opera for adults. Is there a difference between spending all your spare time either drinking with your pals or watching Dallas reruns, and then it's time to get up again and go back to work? That's one lifestyle. Another lifestyle is having a little bit of a spiritual life, spending some time thinking about the bigger issues you care about. Maybe, I don't know, it's probably a prejudice on my part that reading a book is a good thing. But what do you think? What are those other exercises of free humanity which a human being ought to be able to engage himself or herself in? Or am I just being elitist? Or is Marx being elitist? That there's a species being activity that workers are kind of blocked from.
So, like, I'm sure there's something, and there's probably a way, like you could say, maybe try to educate yourself, get a better job, something that actually fulfills you more rather than from working paycheck or just kind of doing it. But I feel like a lot of people who could even be like really like introspective, philosophical people could even just do that themselves. Like they could have a job just to make money, because that's kind of what we have to do in the world, it feels like. Because you have to have a job, you have to make money. And I'm like kind of like in response to your other question you said before, I don't even think it was like a better wage. It really changes because a lot of people choose to become like doctors or something just because of the money. And so they're not like feeling extremely fulfilled with their job either. They're just making the money. And obviously a doctor's wage is much different from minimum wage. So they're in the same scenario, different pay. So I think like,
meaning they're overworked, they're distracted from their inner nature,
like,
their freedom.
Doctors can work like 12-hour shifts for a week, and at the end of that, like the 12-hour like shift long week, they're like dead on their feet, but they still have to work, and they're still like, and you'd say it's even a worse position because they're being forced to treat people when they're not even right of mind. So it's like kind of like an intense, like it's kind of affecting most jobs now that's kind of the expectation. Or like, I guess, I've heard a lot of bad stories about, what is it, like postdoc or whatever, like right when you come out and you're not making any money, but you have to work like really hard after your med degree. I don't know.
Fellowship. Well, there's house officer resident,
I think
residency, and then there's fellowship.
I think
Fellowship, you get
fellowship, that's the
decent
one
pay
that
for it.
really is like not a good, or residency, I think it's the other, like those.
Right.
They're not.
Okay, so you might say we could write a theory of alienation for medical students and graduates and residents and house officers and fellows, and even working surgeons who have weird hobbies and listen to crazy music while they're operating on people, and they do apparently. Loud music in the surgical suite. So you could make a similar kind of argument. Yeah. I'm just not sure quite where to go from here, because Marx clearly believes that there's more to life than simply the drudgery of all-consuming work and all-consuming entertainment. That's why I was kind of making aspersions to watching Dallas all the time. But how true is it of a lot of us? Do we stream a lot of stupid videos on Amazon and Netflix? I suppose we do. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess like my thing is like, I'm not trying to like advocate or say it's a good thing, I guess, like, but I do think it is a real thing that people do, even on non-minimum wage, that they work for money and then they just kind of do nothing with the rest of their life and try to kind of decompress from their job. Like that's what they spend their entire time doing, is trying to like decompress and get themselves in a good position so they can go back to work the next day. And a lot of people don't have time to like, I guess, entertain the more like philosophical betterment of themselves part because they're so focused on like, I'm stressed with my job and I need to get unstressed and then they go back to their job and get stressed. So it's like a vicious cycle. So I think it's a major issue that so many people get stuck in this scenario and they don't have time to like self-reflect or think about themselves or try to prove themselves at all. Or just keep themselves too busy with hobbies and stuff that they enjoy and that are more physical helpful. Like a lot of people do sports, or a lot of people like do games with their friends on the weekend. Like it's not a bad thing, but it like really fills up your time. And I feel like a lot of people are at a point where they don't feel like happy just doing nothing.
Right.
Like they don't feel fulfilled, but that's when like a lot of stuff happens, is when you do have it and you're able to.
So we're kind of sliding into something that actually the honors program is interested in, which is, I don't know, it seems a little lofty to call it the meaning of life. But what is a good human life? What is a good and satisfying life that one can be at the end of life, be, you know, happy with that? I'm glad I spent my life that way. There is kind of a joke that's told about, I don't know, office workers. Nobody ever said at the end of their life, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. You ever hear that joke? But the question about what is a good human life, that actually is a profound, I mean, you know that it's a profound question. What is it that gives us a sense of meaning and pride and association with others? How important would it be, for example, and this is maybe partially a response, to be alienated from species being is to be alienated from my own freedom, but it's also to be alienated from my serious and genuine relationships with other people. And Marx's view is that our sociality is really very deep for us, but in a, I don't know, in a Manchester slum, it's tough to have, you know, deep, important, and moving forward social interpersonal relationships. What you just said about, you know, maybe you're a soccer player, you play soccer with a youth, not youth league, but a young adult league on weekends. And, you know, maybe that actually would fall into the category of humanly satisfying, humanly fulfilling the conversations that you have, the interactions that you have, the pride that you take in your own play, and the recognition you have of other people's play. No reason not to imagine that that is an important part of a, you know, a fully human life. Hard to see how that 18-hour or 16-hour a day Manchester worker 6 days a week has the opportunity for any of that. But yeah, okay, it's an interesting point. Let's move on to the Communist Manifesto just for a couple of minutes. We've got a few minutes left here. By 1848, there were major social movements. Well, I say major, but I also think, you know, in one surprising sense, they were kind of minor. The radical movements in Paris and in Berlin and in other places in Europe, which eventually became the revolutions of 1848. The Communist Manifesto was written as intended to be kind of a theoretical guide to revolution in 1848. And it, of course, reflects Marx's own idea about class struggle. which right at the beginning of the hour, I was kind of saying, this is too narrow a conception. It only gets one aspect of social life. But I thought it was worth pulling out a few paragraphs. Here's one that is kind of an interesting paragraph because it's positive about the implications of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. What does that mean, actually? Constantly revolutionizing yeah, go ahead.
You have to continually get more efficient.
Yeah, so getting more efficient is a part of it, but revolutionizing probably means even more than that. It means having major breakthroughs in technology. So it's really about industrial revolution. So replacing one technology with another technology, which is in turn replaced by yet a third technology. Sailing, craft, moving goods all over the world, being replaced by steam-driven engines. You know, that's a major shift. That is revolutionizing the instruments of production. And with them, the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of the existence of the earlier industrial classes. So it's kind of looking back to the turn of the 19th century, 1800-ish, where there was the idea that we can retain a lot of the social structure we have, but we can just introduce factories, let's say. Constant revolutionizing of production. This is really, it's almost his celebration of capitalism. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. Constant change. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudice and opinion are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. This is one of the most famous, I don't think you've probably heard this sentence before, but it has turned out to be a very famous sentence. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober sense his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. So the idea is that capitalism is a huge improvement over the medieval economy or the classical economy, the ancient world. It's a huge, exactly because it has this dynamic of change, which leads to greater productivity, greater production of wealth, and so forth. And he has actually a subtext here. It is that with this capacity for amazing productivity, there's also the capacity for a high material standard of living for everyone. Being able to produce shirts at $8 a shirt in total labor and technology costs means that everybody can have decent shirts. It's not just for the aristocrat with his riding crop and his pink jacket for riding after the hounds or after the foxes. It's for everyone to have a nice factory-made shirt because it's so cheap. Everyone can have milk, safe, clean, unadulterated milk, because the milk industry, the farming industry has been changed so much. How did the farming industry, let's move forward to the 20th century. How has farming changed in the past 50 years? This is Jeopardy. Yes.
Well, we have better machinery and stuff.
Better machinery, more machinery, that's true. And size of production, what would you say?
Yeah, it's bigger.
So bigger farms, corporate farms. So corporate farming is probably the largest source of, actually, it would be interesting to know whether corporate dairy farming is bigger than medium to large scale family dairy farming. I would be curious to know the answer to that, because there still are tons of, kind of large, they're businesses. They're not little family farms at 60 acres and 20 cows. But they're also not owned by Archer Daniels Midland, which is a major grain company. Yeah.
Kind of a tangent, so I'm doing it really quick. I think corporate is bigger, or at least big enough because fun fact, they lobby the FDA to keep milk on the whole myplate thing in the food news because you don't actually need it.
Uh-huh.
So they're pretty big.
That's pretty interesting. And can you get Hershey's chocolate into that group? Even with all the lobbying that the Pennsylvania food lobby has, no, you can't get chocolate. That's too bad, because it would be great to have chocolate in that pie diagram of, or maybe pie, get pie into the nutritional diagram. Major change. I mean, it is absolutely clear that farming in the United States changed dramatically from 1920 to 2020. And in terms of scale of operation, family farms being more and more imperiled, much larger farms, much more use of mechanization. Was mechanization a great thing in the 1980s, do you think? In farming? No, you probably wouldn't know. I know, because I come from farming country in addition to industrial country. Family farmers overinvested. They overborrowed in order to buy international harvester tractors and harvesters and so forth at $100,000 a pop. And when grain prices dropped, their loans were recalled, they lost their farms. There was a huge range of foreclosures in the 1980s in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, that resulted from an over effort, to do this kind of revolutionizing of, well, no given farmer was coming forward and saying, I want to revolutionize American farming. He or she was saying, I want to be a productive farmer. I want to make a lot of money at farming, which is maybe kind of a, not too promising a business plan. But overinvestment in technology actually led to a lot of bankruptcy. Let's move forward to the end of this. Well, this is actually owing to the Communist Manifesto is telling us a story, but it's Marx's story. It's not just kind of neutral history. It's history as told by the narrative of class conflict and economic change. And there are other stories that can be told, but this is an important paragraph in this particular story. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character. That's what we were talking about before. Working in the Rouge plant, it's just unskilled labor, period. And consequently, all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage to the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. That is straight out of the playbook for Rouge plant, 1930. But of course, Marx died in 1888, so he's like seeing the future. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for maintenance and for the propagation of his race. Now, what does he mean by that, actually? What he means is you can't pay a starvation wage and expect to have the working class, because people starve on a starvation wage. So they have to be able to cover the means of subsistence. But does that mean that they need to have a chicken in every pot on Sundays? I believe that was a political promise in the 1930s, a chicken in every pot. Does it mean they have to have nice food, good food, nutritious food? No, it means they have to have enough calories to keep their children from being severely malnourished. So if you've ever looked at the photography of the Farm Security Agency or Farm Security Administration, FSA, from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s Depression, the pictures of farm families, they're very poignant. They're these skinny little kids. Have you seen any of those black and white photographs? There's one that's almost a Madonna by a very famous woman photographer of the 1930s. I'd love to show it to you, I can't take the time. But she's holding her child, and they're all fleeing the Dust Bowl from Arkansas in the middle of America heading for California. The idea was California, the movie that you certainly ought to see is Grapes of Wrath, beautiful movie. Dorothea Lange is the photographer that I'm thinking of. But the idea that he's expressing here is you can't have an economy that routinely pays workers less than the cost of reproduction, the cost, what it costs to feed a family and to keep adequate nutrition. But adequate nutrition can be pretty low and can be malnutrition, can lead to skinny kids and poor health. But the price of a commodity, that is the price of labor, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. That's kind of a Marxist economic principle. What does a price reach equilibrium at? Well, his claim is it reaches equilibrium at the cost of production of that good. What does it cost to produce a week of labor time from a worker? Well, if mom and dad are both workers, they're just you do the math. It costs $80 a week to feed and house a working class family. Then mom needs to get, let's say, $40 a week, and dad needs to get $40 a week. That's $80 a week. That's where the individual wage will reach equilibrium at $40. Female work in the 1930s was less common. And so in that case, the equilibrium will be for the single wage earner rather than for the two wage earners. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases. In the same proportion, the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of working hours, by the increase of work exacted in a given time, or the increasing speed of machinery. That sounds like blah, 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 blah. But actually, those are three, let's call it smart, mean, cruel, but smart ways of enhancing profits. I've hired you all to work in my factory, and I've hired you for 10 hours a day because there's a 10-hour limitation to the working day. It's legal. But I can make you work faster. You work on a machine, I can amp the machine up so it's working 5% faster. So you have to work a little bit faster. Or you're on piece work, and I lower the piece work compensation. Whereas you used to be paid for doing 500 shirt collars, you used to be paid a nickel per shirt collar. Now you're paid 4 cents per shirt collar. So for you to keep your income the same, you have to do the math and figure out how many more shirt collars do I need to finish in order to keep my salary the same. So these are changes which the employer has at his or possibly her control, leading to what Marx calls the immiseration of the working person. Well, we got to stop. I'm going to spend one more day on Marx. I think this is really important stuff. It means one fewer days at dead dog Machiavelli, and that's okay with me. So we'll have one day on Machiavelli, but we'll complete Marx on Tuesday. So just do all of the reading. Let's have, your thoughts about the thing. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.